So the Prime Minister is to give a major speech in Florence within the next hour in an effort to unlock stalled talks on the Brexit negotiations. Theresa May expected to propose a 2-year transitional period, as well as offering a divorce payment possibly between 20 and 40 billion pounds.
But she will insist Britain's future is bright and tell EU leaders that successful negotiations are in everyone's best interest. Well, joining us now, Imke Henkel, a senior lecturer in journalism at Lincoln University and writer for the online version of Des Eight, the French writer and broadcaster Nabila Ramdani, and the Independent's political commentator John Rentoul, who's in Westminster for us this afternoon. Welcome to you all. Let's start with you, first of all, Imke, forgive that mispronunciation there. What are we expecting this afternoon? Are we expecting all that we've heard before? Because that's been the criticism thus far, that she's probably just going to tell us what we already know and what she's already said.
No, we hope, of course, that not. And the two crucial points to watch for are obviously the budget. And, well, there have been leaked figures before, between 18 and 20 billion. The crucial question there will be whether this is a figure that will be the final figure or whether there's still some negotiation and how it will be interpreted. Because so far it looks like and Theresa May tries to make it a kind of nice gesture that she gives us 20 billion, agrees on this 20 billion that is basically towards the budget. But there are 5 items, as the Commission has made clear, where the EU thinks that Britain actually owes money as a kind of as a legal matter for pensions, for example, for legal obligations they have made before. So we will see whether there's a closer point. And the other point, of course, is the rights for EU citizens who live in Britain and the other way around. And we might have some movement there from what we heard before.
Nabila, if the 20 billion figure is mentioned by the Prime Minister or something around that, does she lock herself into that? Like Imke was saying, it could well be more than that, depending on how the negotiations go. Is it wise to put a figure out there?
Well, I think what everybody would be looking for today is the nitty-gritty, and one would hope to hear a lot more detail than has been said before, and that would be the expectations on her speech today. But I think, as she's trying to negotiate a very complicated divorce bill in the end, and as with all divorces, it all amounts to money. The bottom line question is who will be paying for what? And so everybody will be looking for that figure, not least of all financiers and the business community, as it were, and indeed French and German people watching. In the end, these are the founding fathers, the founding countries of the EU project, and arguably the most powerful countries that will be involved in the Brexit negotiations. So it will all be boiling down to money. But dare I say, this idea that politicians hold all the cards in their hands, I think is slightly flawed, because in the end, politicians are not in very particularly secure positions themselves. We see how Angela Merkel is facing an election at home. Theresa May's situation in Britain speaks for itself. Emmanuel Macron has also sliding figures at home. He's facing industrial strife and has to sort out the economy in his own country. And in my view, it will be more the banks and indeed huge companies, the economic power players per se, who will have a far bigger role in all this, where they would like to set up their businesses, how they are going to manage their companies, rather than politicians and governments per se.
Okay.
John Rentoul, if we bring you in here, where do you think the Prime Minister will fall in terms of, will we see hard figures? Will we see her quoting figures? And will she then, as we've been discussing, tie herself into that commitment?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it'll be very interesting because we know the speech is 5,000 words long, so there ought to be some specifics in it. The material that was briefed to the press overnight was full of platitudes, but you can't do 5,000 words of platitudes in Florence. So it will be interesting to see what number she puts on it. More than that, it'll be how the numbers are calculated, because if it's just 20 billion, that's really just us continuing our subscription to the EU for the 2 years of the transition period, because we pay about 10 billion euros a year. So I think our EU partners would recognise that 20 billion is actually equivalent to zero.
Let's just briefly have a listen to what Mrs May said in her Lancaster House speech back at the start of the year, specifically about whether a no-deal situation would be good or bad for the country.
While I am sure a positive agreement can be reached, I am equally clear that no deal for Britain is better than a bad deal for Britain. Britain wants to remain a good friend and neighbour to Europe. Yet I know there are some voices calling for a punitive deal that punishes Britain and discourages other countries from taking the same path. That would be an act of calamitous self-harm for the countries of Europe, and it would not be the act of a friend.
Imke, that's a key point, isn't it? And one that's been made over and over again by Jean-Claude Juncker. They don't want this to seem an easy process. They don't want others to get the wrong idea. And we were told about the sort of domino effect. Once the UK goes, perhaps other countries might leave if it's made too easy. So it's not in the remaining 27's interest to make this easy.
Well, I think this notion of a punitive deal is absolutely nonsense, and I think it's an extraordinary and just remind us where she was at that time. And I think I guess this speech will be quite different. To say that no deal is better than any deal is certainly not in UK's interest. It's not in Europe's interest as well. But no deal will be disastrous. Will be disastrous actually for banks, will be disastrous for business, and will be disastrous for ordinary people in Britain, because it will mean that Britain will face quite a severe economic situation, and it will impoverish the country. But I think one should also realise that why not punitive? I mean, it is, of course, it is in the interest of the European Union not to be damaged by the UK leaving, but we do not need to fear that it looks like an easy process, because it is difficult on its own. We do not need to make it, or the EU does not need to make it artificially complicated. There are so many treaties that need to be renegotiated. There are so many actually intricate arrangements that have grown over the last 40 years that need to be disentangled. This is tremendous. It is fiendishly difficult on its own, and a lot of time has been lost. I think by now, not even the British government would say that can be just a walk in the park, and certainly not that no deal will be better than whatever a bad deal.
Just want to ask John about this no-deal scenario. As we look, I believe we can show you pictures of the venue that the speech is taking place, Santa Maria Novella Church. So John, while we look at those pictures, I'll ask you about that no-deal scenario. Would you expect that to go into the long grass now?
Oh no, I mean, I think the prospect of the negotiations breaking down and there being no agreement at the end of it is quite a high chance, and it's one that people are very worried about on the British side. Certainly, civil servants in the Brexit department are very nervous about it, and I think the politicians are too. And so it'll be interesting to see what Theresa May says about that, what her language is like, because so far it hasn't been, the negotiations haven't been acrimonious, but it's plain. As she said there, this, a punishment deal would not be the action of a friend. But, during the election campaign, when she called the election, she did accuse Brussels and unnamed European leaders of trying to do Britain down. So, the atmosphere could go rather bad.
Nabila, this idea that was put out there by the Prime Minister at Lancaster House back in January of no deal being better, potentially, than a bad deal. Do you think we've seen her move away from that stance now to a more conciliatory tone?
Well, I think so, and I think she certainly moved away from the idea that, that the rest of the EU countries want to actually punish Britain. I don't buy into that kind of, idea at all, and I think that EU countries have ahead of them this colossal task to go through, given the timescale already. This idea, they have to go all these through the negotiations, treaties, and other EU paraphernalia, and the idea that they reserve some time to hand out some punishment to the British people is actually quite fanciful. I think what Britain is trying to do effectively is to reassess its relationship with the EU rather than Brexiting per se. Strong relationships with its neighbours will remain in every sphere, from health, education, sport, you name it, and not least of all business and trade, of course. So this idea that Britain can pull out is fanciful in my view. And let's not forget that Britain has actually done pretty well over the years within the EU, in my view, and what it's trying to do now is to disentangle itself from 40 years plus from working within the system, and we expect Theresa May to act as some kind of Margaret Thatcher, like a Britannia figure. But let's not forget that Margaret Thatcher actually worked the system from within the EU, and it's easy to forget that it's actually one of her appointees, Arthur Cofield, who was the architect and indeed the engineer of the single market.
Okay.
Can it also actually briefly remind us of also an exercise done by Cameron still, that he over years assessed how well actually Britain did out of the EU. A 3,000 page, I think, a very detailed study, and it was actually buried quietly after it came out that Britain did indeed very well of the EU and profited. Just for the no-deal scenario again, as much as the hard Brexiters still try to push it and still try to make it appear a viable solution, I think it tells you that business increasingly says, actually, we want a transit deal. We want some kind of buffer zone between us leaving and really leaving. Shows you that no-deal scenario is not viable at all, because this kind of transit will not be possible without a deal.
Well, on that note, we have heard that one of the things we expect the Prime Minister to say is that there will be this 2-year transitional period, possibly still within the single market as we know it now. Here's what she said at the start of the year regarding single market membership.
What I am proposing cannot mean membership of the single market. It would, to all intents and purposes, mean not leaving the EU at all. And that is why both sides in the referendum campaign made it clear that a vote to leave the EU would be a vote to leave the single market.
John Rentoul, a bit of a U-turn there, we think, we've identified. The transitional period, this is exactly what would happen. It would be as if we were still in the single market for a period possibly of 2 years, so we wouldn't have left for all intents and purposes.
Well, it would be as if we were in the single market. Now, this is where we are expecting and looking for some clarity in Theresa May's speech this afternoon, because she hasn't made it completely clear what happens to free movement of people during this transitional period. We know there's going to be a registration scheme, but registering people could be consistent with free movement of people. But she has previously said, as you just saw there, that that leaving the EU is not compatible with the single market, and therefore we must cease to be members of the single market. Now, the question is what happens in the transitional period for the 2 years, and we need to hear more details about that. And then the other thing we're looking for more detail on, of course, is what happens after that, what the end position is that she's negotiating towards.
Nabila, can you foresee any situation where during the transition period we have the same single market benefits that we have now without free movement of people?
Well, I think, what Theresa May and her government are trying to do is to redefine Britain's position in the world and specifically within the EU. And as we all agreed around this table, Britain has been doing brilliantly out of the system over the years, not least of all because Margaret Thatcher, was able to negotiate that massive rebate, stay out of Schengen and retain the sterling, for example. So one of the great ironies in my mind is that one of the greatest players of the EU was in fact Britain. And I can't see any possibility of Britain actually pulling out Completely.
So the transitional period for you, so if it's 2 years from starting 2019, that 2 years is going to look exactly the same as now?
Yeah.
Yes, it's one of the greatest irony that it might take years or even, let's say, decades for Britain to go back to its initial position, in fact.
And do you ever foresee a position where this transitional period will be extended and extended further and extended further?
Well, we'll see. I mean, first of all, Juncker has already made it clear, or I think Barnier has actually already made it clear, if it is if Britain would stay in a single market in a transitional period, that would of course include free movement, and it actually doesn't make sense for transitional to negotiate a different thing for the transitional agreement from what we have now, and then again negotiate another thing, because we would just be drowned in negotiations. So if you want a transition period, it only makes sense if it stays the same and actually gives British business but also European business some room to breathe. Whether that then will go on and on and on, you know what, I don't see that. The situation would have to change tremendously. It only would change if Britain indeed realised after another 2 years that leaving the single market would be so disastrous, would be really ruin Britain, that it is politically achievable. But if you just assume that Britain again pays for the budget, what happens if the budget is increased, as the EU budget is increased after a while? If you then vote on the budget, is Britain still voting with it, or in traditional period not voting with it? Will the Parliament, will the government here decide to actually condone an increased budget and condone an increased payment for it? If the single market changes with new regulation, as it's bound to happen, of course it happens all the time, is that something that will be brought into British business as well? So we would just have this prolonged discussion that we have now, and I do not see that going on forever. Britain decided to leave, it will leave, but it would be beneficial, most of all for Britain, but also for the European countries, to give it a bit more time, especially after the Prime Minister wasted a year with not doing anything in negotiations and just losing her majority.
OK, Nabila, Imke, John, thank you for now. They'll stay with us for a little bit. Around half an hour's time, that's when we're expecting Prime Minister Theresa May to take to the lectern there in Florence in Italy to give us some more details, more flesh on the bone maybe, of what Brexit's going to look like.
So, in a matter of minutes, we should hear the Prime Minister make her bid to convince European leaders of her Brexit plan. Well, joining us now to discuss this is Imke Henkel, Senior Lecturer in Journalism at Lincoln University and writer for the online version of Debate, the French writer and broadcaster Nabila Ramdani, and the Independent's political commentator John Rentoul, who's in our Westminster studio. Welcome to you all three. John, if I start with you first, because you're not here with us in the studio, so we don't want to have you feeling left out. First of all, let's talk about why Theresa May is giving this speech rather than this taking place behind closed doors and being part of the negotiations. Why is she doing this?
Well, I think she's trying to, she's trying to sort of kick-start the negotiating process, because, as everyone's commented, that it has stalled somewhat, and the EU negotiators' position is that they can't discuss the final terms of our relationship with the EU until we've settled the Brexit issues. But as the government fairly points out, I think, you can't settle the problem of, say, the border with Northern Ireland, between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, without deciding what our final trading relationship is going to be with the EU. So it does all have to be discussed at once, and that's why I think Theresa May is going to make a substantial speech with a lot of detail in it, we're told. There better be, because otherwise 5,000 words of platitudes is going to be a big letdown on all sides. But I think it's time for her to, lay out in public some of her negotiating position.
Just picking up on the point John made there about the border with Northern Ireland, it seems fairly obvious, doesn't it, that you cannot decide what that border is going to look like the EU27 are demanding, without knowing exactly what the trade situation is going to be there.
Actually, I agree, absolutely. And I find it slightly arbitrary that the Northern Irish border is actually in this package together with the Brexit financial settlement and with the right for EU citizens. Because in a way, you can understand the financial settlements, absolutely. You can, up to a point, understand the EU citizen rights. It's just you could debate that, but you cannot really understand why the northern border, the Northern Irish border, has to be settled.
So is that an example of the EU being far too dig our heels in and not flexible enough?
I think actually it is, but the extraordinary thing is that the UK has been very much in a PR disaster about the whole negotiations. It is seen on the continent by now pretty much as a joke. I mean, contributing and Boris Johnson wading into it just contributes a lot to this, Britain being seen as a joke recently. The United Kingdom has not managed to make it clear what their position really is, what they really want. It has not laid out a consistent process. And so we sort of came into this narrative that we always had a quite calmly collected EU there, on the other hand, the bustling, chaotic United Kingdom. I have to say, I do not believe that that is the whole truth. I just cannot believe it. I think there are far more issues probably with the EU stance as well, but we just have not looked at it. And the United Kingdom has done, this UK government actually has blundered so extraordinarily that they took all the all views on themselves and all the criticism on themselves.
Just on that border, the Northern Irish border, let's listen in if we can. We've got a clip of the Prime Minister speaking back in January, what she had to say. We did have that clip, but it's not going to be made available to us. It's disappeared. Nabila, let's talk about what we kicked off with John Rentoul, talking about why she's making this big speech, why she's doing that in Florence. There's a suggestion that perhaps it's a divide and rule tactic, that she's speaking to the EU 27, and if they like what they hear, they then can influence the way forward. And Michel Barnier, and perhaps go back to him and say, well, we like the sound of that. Let's move on that.
Yes, I think for the first time, one would hope we'll be hearing more solid details about how Britain is actually going to exit the EU. And we've heard an awful lot of swashbuckling language right up until now. And it's going to be important for Britain and, you know, the importance of it all. And we've heard so far certainly quite compelling arguments about why Britain is exiting or has chosen to exit. And I know that there are a lot of people in Britain and indeed outside the EU, including in France, who have seen a lot of reasons for that, not least of all when discussing subjects, one would say emotive subjects such as sovereignty or indeed immigration. But I think, you know, EU countries would of course be watching and listening to this speech intently, even though perhaps less avidly as some British people would like. And I think Brexit is a hugely important issue for the UK, but not necessarily, you know, one of the prime consideration of other EU countries. And I think what Theresa May will be trying to do will be to appeal to nation states over and above the EU. And that's the whole point about Brexit. There's a blinding logic in that. If you want to deal with Portugal, deal with the head of state in Portugal.
John,
if you want to deal with France, go straight to the French president.
Can we ask what your reaction to something Nabila mentioned there and Imke mentioned in the last hour as well? The fact that the EU need to see more detail from Britain is something that we hear a lot from that side. The government, I suppose, would say that they have released position papers in August. They have put some things on the table. Is that criticism fair?
What, the criticism of the British government? No, I don't think it is. I think the British government has provided quite a lot of detail. I mean, it is fair to say that the British government has not finally decided what its position is on the final end point, and we do hope to hear some of that today. And it's fair to say that Theresa May called a general election which did rather distract her and her government from the negotiating process. But equally, I think you have to say that the EU negotiators have been very slow in saying where they stand on a lot of the British proposals. I mean, we still haven't heard from the EU 27 what they think about the idea of a transition period, how long it should be and what nature they would be prepared to accept and what they would accept on free movement of people during that period. So I think there's a lot to be given on both sides, and I think there are criticisms to be made on both sides.
Let's get some reaction to some news that we are just hearing in the last few seconds while you were talking there, John. According to the Telegraph newspaper, Theresa May might raise the possibility of the UK leaving the EU before March 2019 in this speech that she's about to make. Imke, reaction to that? If it's true, that's the Telegraph saying that. Is that a hardball tactic?
Well, it sounds to me crazy, I have to say. I mean, the problem that we have at the moment, if you want a deal, the time is extremely limited. And that is not just the EU saying that, that is actually civil servants saying that, and everyone who has a closer look at the negotiations. So leaving before that would mean, okay, we leave without a deal. Fine. I mean, it's bad for everyone. It's bad for the EU, certainly, but it's even worse for the UK. And I fail to understand, really, why at this point you would try still to blackmail the EU in doing something that is even more harmful for the UK.
OK, Imke, Nabila and John, stay with us. We are going to take a break, still waiting for the Prime Minister to hit that podium and begin that all-important Brexit speech in Florence. Stay with us.
Welcome back. We are waiting for Theresa May to take to the lectern in Florence for this Brexit speech that she's giving. In the last few seconds, the Telegraph newspaper are reporting that she is going to raise the prospect of leaving the EU before 2019 in this speech. John Rentoul, who's in our Westminster studio. What do you make of that, John? Where has it come from and why?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, it's presumably come from someone seeing an early draft of the speech. But, I mean, the point is that it's only possible for us to leave before the 29th of March 2019 if there's an agreement. Because the way the Article 50 process works is it sets a 2-year timetable. There's a 2-year clock ticking. If there isn't agreement by the end of that 2-year period, which is the 29th of March 2019, then we leave anyway without a deal. So the only way you can cut that process short would be to secure a deal early. And I don't see that that's very likely, given the complexity of the whole process.
Or no deal? Yeah. It's either you do a deal early or
but no deal can only happen on the 29th of March 2019, because no deal only happens when the clock actually runs out and you've failed to actually agree something. So it's not a threat. I don't understand what it is. It may be just suggesting that if we can agree the transition deal quickly, we can get on with it, start the transition period and get on with the negotiations about the trade relationship after the transition period.
Imke, you seem to think that you could declare a no deal.
I'm not entirely sure, I have to admit, but I think you could just, if you say no, we're not going to reach a deal, you could leave at any point. I think the 2 years it can't be longer than that. But if you just say, OK, we are not going to have a deal.
And that's exactly, Nabila, that's exactly what Brexiteers on the harder, quote-unquote, side would want, isn't it? They want the possibility of walking away, saying, we're done with this, we're out, we'll go.
Well, absolutely. And if this rumour turns out to be true, I think it makes a great deal of sense that the whole point of Brexit is not to rely on technocrats sitting in Brussels and doing quite well out of it. And if Britain goes down that route, then it has a great honesty, in approaching things like that. I think, what May will be trying to do is to appeal to nation states directly, but also to business communities. And there will, of course, be a great deal of symbolism in May's speech taking place in Florence, of course, which is the Renaissance trade capital. It's made its name and reputation on exporting capitalism, and that's precisely what Britain wants to do again, not just with EU nation state, but also redefining its position in the world and perhaps, retain or revigorate its status almost as an imperial nation flying the Union
Agree.
Jack
Agree.
again all over the world.
Actually, if she really would try to address the nations above and over the head of the EU, that would betray a abysmal misunderstanding of how it
works. I'm going to have to stop
works.
you there, Imke. Prime Minister taking to the stage.
It's good to be here in this great city of Florence today, at a critical time in the evolution of the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. It was here, more than anywhere else, that the Renaissance began, a period of history that inspired centuries of creativity and critical thought across our continent, and which in many ways defined what it meant to be European. A period of history whose example shaped the modern world. A period of history that teaches us that when we come together in a spirit of ambition and innovation, we have it within ourselves to do great things. That shows us, if we open our minds to new thinking and new possibilities, we can forge a better, brighter future for all our peoples. And that is what I want to focus on today. For we are moving through a new and critical period in the history of the United Kingdom's relationship with the European Union. The British people have decided to leave the EU and to be a global, free-trading nation able to chart our own way in the world. For many, this is an exciting time, full of promise. For others, it is a worrying one. I look ahead with optimism, believing that if we use this moment to change not just our relationship with Europe, but also the way we do things at home, this will be a defining moment in the history of our nation. And it is an exciting time for many in Europe too.